Hello, everyone. My name is Chukudi. I am the Assessment Solutions Consultant for Turnitin Asia Pacific. Today, we're continuing what we started earlier in the year, which is a four-part series looking at turbocharging your assessments with Gradescope. The aim of this session is to support academics and educators around the Asia Pacific region with reimagining assessment delivery to maximize teaching and learning while protecting integrity in remote and hybrid environments. As it is customary for us here in Australia, I would like to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge the elders of the land for which Turnitin does its business, which is the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. I want to pay my respect to all elders past, present, and emerging for all in the different regions for which our audience are also beaming into this session. And for this session, I'd like to do a quick introduction to Daniel. Daniel is the head of science department at Carey Baptist College. He teaches years 7 to 10 science and 8 physics. He's passionate about improving the educational outcomes for students through innovation and improving teaching practice, without also increasing the workload of teachers, which is the key to his presentation today. His presentation is going to be titled Faster and Smarter Marking with Gradescope. Over to you, Daniel.
Hi, good morning from Perth, afternoon, I suspect, to most other places in the country and the world. So I'm Daniel, Head of Science at Carey Baptist College. What we're going to be looking at today is just a little bit of an introduction to the context that we find ourselves in here at Carey, what we were doing before Gradescope, and why we chose Gradescope. And then really, in essence, looking at what we've found through the 6 months we've been using Gradescope, how it's improved the marking here at Carey, and where we're going to take things in the future. So Carey Baptist College is a K-12 Christian school in Perth, southeast. I guess if you want to know, I'm probably sitting in this building somewhere down here. We have 2 campuses, and at our particular campus in Harrisdale, we have a primary and a secondary, and I sit within the secondary school science department. In our science department, approximately 580 students, years 7 to 10, and then of those students, we probably end up about half of those studying ATAR. So that's those of you in other parts of the state, that's equivalent, I think, to VCE or HSE. And so we have roughly 60 students in year 11 and 60 in year 12. In our science department, a team of 9 teachers. And I did some sums earlier. So each teacher would mark an average of 29 assessments, that's a test per year, per teacher. And so that works out to be, in any given week across our 9 teachers, 16 test papers, and 2 exams, but it doesn't all happen per week, nicely spread out. It usually happens in very intense periods of time. Our journey with Gradescope at the moment is that we're currently trialing within the science department. So we've really had Gradescope for 6 months, for 1 semester. And I would say we're in a transition phase. So we're trying to work out, where does Gradescope sit within our assessment marking practice? I guess you could say we're trying to find the sweet spot for Gradescope to fit, to really complement what we're trying to do in improving student outcomes. So before Gradescope, I guess we would be typically like most schools in Perth. I suspect most schools in Australia, we had tests and exams were marked by hand. And that would come back to students as relatively low quality feedback. So at our school, that would come back to students mostly ticks and crosses. And the return of tests would take anywhere between 1 to 2 weeks. And so there's limited opportunity from that to action any feedback. And I would say that what happens when we hand tests back is the students would look at 3 things. They would look at their mark, they would look at their friend's mark, and they would look at the class average. And that's basically the limit of the feedback that they would be taking in, because ticks and crosses are meaningless. And the teachers would go through a marking scheme with the students. But in terms of effectiveness, it's so long after the test has been taken, there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do with that feedback that the students can actually action to improve their understanding of content or concepts. In addition to that, the teachers are marking their own classes. So we have limited moderation between the classes. And really all we have is an agreed upon marking scheme. But I think what we'll see later is even how that marking scheme is interpreted is showing that different teachers are marking in slightly different ways, which is actually having a relatively significant effect on averages between classes. So why Gradescope? Well, the big question for the Science Department strategic plan for this year was, can we improve feedback to students without also increasing time demands on teachers? So really what we're looking at here is, can we improve student outcomes without killing our teachers? And so our Gradescope really started with a tweet from me on the 3rd of May, 2021. And I got a few ideas. Gradescope was mentioned by one of the people who responded to my tweets, and I didn't do anything with that. And so here's a little bit of shout out to the efficiency of the detective work of the Turnitin salespeople. Is Mackenzie 2 days later hit me with an email saying, I heard you were asking questions on Twitter. Here's what we've got to offer. So that, you know, it saved me a lot of time, and we may actually never have been here without that email. So how does Gradescope make our assessments faster and smarter? So it starts with paper tests being submitted and uploaded to Gradescope. So there is actually a slight increase in prep time. So there's a certain amount of scanning and uploading to do at the beginning, but actually that we're finding that pays itself back in time later. Gradescope gives us a rubric within the system to ensure that there's consistent marking. So Gradescope call it a rubric. I'd probably call it a marking key. And what it does is you have to tick the box to say the student has achieved that particular item on the marking key. And what we're seeing there is that even in and of itself, it is making our marking more accurate, because if it's just ticks and crosses on a paper, it's very hard for someone to come back and look and go, well, why did you give that cross, or why did you give that tick? How was that mark paid? Whereas if you're ticking a little box next to an item on a marking key, it provides transparency, and which means that the student really has to have earned it for you to give it. It also provides them easy navigation. So once the tests are scanned, they get batch scanned, and the system has got some real great AI smarts in there that separate the tests out by students, allocating them to students. But then once you start marking, it's just really a case of pressing arrow keys between questions, all of question 1 for a test paper. And within that marking scheme, there are some types of questions where Gradescope has got some artificial intelligence in there, which actually means that your marking process is even quicker, because it has some text recognition, or for multiple choice type questions, it can recognize which boxes students have shaded in. Or you can move to a system where you kind of group assessments by yourself and then mark them as batches of grouped answers. It also saves time because you don't have to add up at the end. There's no manual adding up of the marks. That's already done for you. And I've found particularly that when you have parent inquiries or parent-teacher evenings, when you're wanting to pull up a student's assessment, it's all stored online on the system. So if you want to talk about a particular test or a particular piece of work, it's very easy to retrieve. You're not kind of opening up boxes of papers trying to find the student work. So here's a little video I made earlier about some of the artificial intelligence marking. So this is just an example assessment of filling in the blank. So what Turnitin does is you'll select an option to say to recognize a fill in the blank word. This question was to do with biology in year 7. And so I'll talk over what's happening here. So really what we're doing is we're selecting the question to grade. We're asking it to recognize the text, and then the system processes the answers. So what the system is now doing is essentially reading student answers for the fill in the blank. And it feels like it's going to take a long time, but once a little green line appears, it happens pretty quick. And so this is running through 65 submissions. And one of the things we really like about Gradescope is the time process is actually not much different for 65 to say 150. Then what I'm doing here is I'm actually selecting all the answers that I think are actually correct. So this is to do with spelling mistakes from students. What I'm noting is checking that they are correct. These are blanks, I'm checking those. And then it leaves me with the answers of students that the AI hasn't been able to allocate, and I'm now allocating those to the box. And you can see some of them haven't been allocated because the student writing isn't clear or they've crossed things out. So everything that's correct goes into a particular box. Now I'm selecting everything that is not correct. And I'm grouping that as an incorrect. And then I'm grading my answers. And the power here is I'm grading answers by batch. So these are all students who are correct. So I'm going to allocate half a mark for correct. I'm going on to my next group. These are incorrect. So I'm marking as 0 for incorrect. And I find it useful also to, if it's blank, to write blank, because that's useful feedback to parents that the student didn't attempt the question. And that's basically how the AI system makes marking 65 single answers really super quick. What do we do if we're grading manually? We'll just pause this one. So if we're wanting to, just check it on there. If we're wanting to now to grade our assessments manually, what does that look like? So this is grading one question at a time. So in the Gradescope system, I'm selecting the question I want to answer. I'm selecting I want to grade them individually. And the first thing I need to do is set up my marking key. So I'm right now setting up the marking key for this question. I only do this once for every student answer. So this is a year 7 biology. And now that the marking key is set up, what I'm doing is I am actually using, let me just pause this for a second because this actually happens pretty quick. What I'm using is shortcut keys. So on the marking key, the 1, 2, 3 relate to actually the 1, 2, 3 key on my keypad. And so what I'm able to do is just press the key pad numbers on my keyboard and assign the marks as we go. And I'm pressing the arrow key simply to move on. And so here I'm going through each student question and I'm reading the questions and then I'm assigning either number 1, 2, or 3 for fully correct 1 and 2, for partially correct 1 or 2, and incorrect for 3. And so the process actually then becomes really quite quick. And it takes a matter of maybe a second per student answer. So you're kind of talking about just over a minute, maybe 2 minutes to mark 65 assessments for that particular question. And how does Gradescope then improve feedback? So this is where this is what we were really looking for with Gradescope, because you can make the marking faster, which is great. But if you can then also improve the feedback, that's really valuable. So this is a year 12 exam. And if you release the test to students online, what do you see on the kind of the left here? This is the student answer. So they've put their answer in here and I see that. And on the right, what they would get back is they can see how I've applied the marking key to their answer. So this student has got their answer correct. And so as they go through their test paper there, they can go through question by question and they can see where they were assigned marks or where they weren't assigned marks. So they see the full rubric, and it only gives them a tick where that rubric has been applied to them, so that they get to interrogate their own work and go through a slow process of analysing their own work. And for me, that's where feedback has its real power, because if the students aren't doing anything, if there's nothing for the students to do, it's not really feedback, it's just information. But if the students are going through a process of interrogation and reflection, then that really becomes powerful feedback. If you don't want to release assessments to students online, so we're currently working through how much do we release online for students because they can download the assessments and keep them, or how much do we keep in-house and not release the full assessment. But what we can provide students is a printout. So this printout is essentially maybe 1, 2, or 3 pages, depending on the size of the test, of how that the marking key has been applied to their question. So for this particular student here, this is their question 10. So this is 10A in their exam. And they can see here that they've got 1 of 3 marks for this question. And they can look at their marking key and they can see, okay, they've got 1 point for giving me a correct formula, but they didn't show any correct working. and their final answer was incorrect. So they can look at that and go, right, I can see now what I did. If I wanted to add correct work, some more details in here, I could add the correct working in for them to see. And what's quite useful is I can add images in, but the images don't print particularly well. So generally we don't at the moment add images into the marking key, but potentially if you're releasing online, you can do that. But again, this process is a student, what they do is they sit down, I give them back their exam or their test paper and their marking sheet, which shows how the marks have been applied. And they then go through question by question as a process of interrogation. Now, the way it's changed that is, a session after an exam is much quieter for my students as they interrogate their own work. I have less students queuing at my desk after we've gone through the marking key, asking why didn't I get this mark? Shouldn't I have got this mark? And the students who do come up with that, to asking why, to me, either it's very clear, okay, I've missed that mark and I need to apply that mark to your marking key, and Gradescope then adds it up for me and I can apply that to my marks book quite easily. Or I can explain to them, no, you didn't get the mark and here's why. Now, previously when I was getting questions back where I'd only ticked and crossed, I'm going to have to go through the process of a full remark in my head of actually why did I give you a cross and a tick at this point? But this provides me with transparency. So that process of that verbal feedback after a test for students is much clearer. It's much more transparent. And I think the students are much happier. So the first time I used Gradescope with my year 12 physics class, this is the first class I tried it with. The first comment I had back was from one student who hadn't done very well. And he said, "Sir, I don't like Gradescope, but I don't think that's because of the system. I think that's because of the marks that you gave me. And there's nothing I can do to fix that." But after a couple of assessments, I started asking students, well, how are you finding this? And in general, the feedback was, yes, it's taken us a little bit of time to get used to this, but we really like it because what we can do is we can see how you've applied the marking key to our answers. We can see where we've missed marks. We can see where we gain marks. And it provides them with a lot more transparency and a lot more to take away with them to implement for the next test or to start revising for another exam. What it does for teachers in feedback, which I think is particularly powerful from the teacher side, is it gives us a feedback analysis by question. So this is a recent year 12 exam, and this shows by question how students have achieved. So I can look through this in Gradescope and I can select questions from the bars and actually look at what was that question, how was the marking key applied, of the marking key, how many, which marking key item did most students get, which item did most students not get. And so what this does is it provides me with feedback on where my students are weak and particular questions. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about doing question level analysis to analyze students' understanding. I think it helps you understand how would they go with that question, but really questions are samples of understanding. You're taking a sample of a student's ability to understand quantum theory in physics, and the question is like the sample, and the mark is kind of like the probability that they do or don't understand that. So what I particularly like about Gradescope is it gives me analysis by topic. So I have a little bit of work for me to add the topic that each question is in the exam. So I do that by applying tags. But what this does now is this gives me how do students go overall on. For example, I highlighted quantum theory because the students did very well and I was very proud of them. And I wanted to show you how great a teacher I am. 79% on quantum theory. And so that shows me that actually really overall the class has got a strong grasp of quantum theory. I don't need to recover that content in any meaningful way. But if I look across and go, well, the standard model of particles, they're a little bit weak. And in orbital motion, they're a little bit weak. Well, actually, now that we've got 2 weeks now from this exam to their final exams, I can spend a little bit of time really focusing on the areas where my class are weak and need a little bit of extra help. And so it provides me with that feedback, and because the marking process is quicker, I'm getting that information quicker and I'm able to implement that quicker. So how does Gradescope improve moderation? So what is really nice about Gradescope is that we set up our year 7 and 8 classes particularly with the whole cohort. So every student in year 8 is in one Gradescope class. And what it allows us to do is collaborate on the marking. So in year 7 and 8, probably 50% of their assessments are common to all of year 8, and 50% would be based on the stream that they're in, whether that's a mainstream or an extension. And so what we're able to do then is have one teacher mark all of question 1, and for example, another teacher mark all of question 2. What it also does for moderation is, as I've already mentioned, it provides transparency for those marks where you go, well, do I give the student this mark or don't I give the student this mark? Well, I have to tick the box. I have to be able to check that box to say the student has achieved that marking key, key item, and it's transparent. So if I've ticked it, someone else could come back later and have a look and say, well, why did that teacher tick that box? And so what it does is those 50-50 marks are actually less likely to be given than given. Gradescope also has the ability to anonymize the marking key. Anonymize the student test. So you can't even see a name, it just gives the student a code. And I find me particularly using Gradescope is that marking one question at a time and not knowing which student is, it reduces what I call a pity mark. So when you're marking a test and you mark a full page or a full 2-page spread in one go, and the student is really struggling and you're not being able to give them any marks, you come to a question where they've kind of got something a little bit right. It's not exactly the marking key, but you feel bad for them and you feel like you really ought to give them something. And so you kind of give them a little bit of a pity mark, even though they haven't earned it. But what Gradescope is doing is eliminating those pity marks. And certainly in the upper years of 10, 11, 12, that's I think that is more consistent, it's more transparent, and it's fairer. So here's a little case study. So this was a moderation. This is an end of topic test across a year group. So this was year 7's, about 150 students. Part A of the test was common to all students. So we collaboratively marked that on Gradescope between the 3 teachers who teach the year 7 students. That's across 5 classes. And then part B of the test was differentiated to the stream and marked by individual teachers. And so some teachers marked those by hand, some teachers marked those on Gradescope for part B, but that was marked by their class only. Both parts had an agreed upon common marking scheme, but this is particularly interesting because of the 3 teachers across 5 classes. And so what I just want to highlight for you here is that is particularly the extension classes. So the extension class is part A, which is collaboratively marked. We've got 84 and 88% here. And that's pretty close. I would expect 2 extension classes to be about the same. We don't group this extension classes by ability, so we don't have like a strong extension and a weak extension. We just spread the students across both classes. So part A marked collaboratively, each question by one teacher, really nice and even marks. Part B marked individually. We've now got one teacher marking extension class 1 at 74% and another teacher at 59%. So really there's an 18% difference in the marking across part B of this test. And so I'm not 100% sure. I haven't interrogated the test yet to see exactly why that is. But my educated guess is it's those 50-50 marks. So one teacher is kind of going, oh, they've just about got there, so I'll give them the mark. Another teacher is kind of going, no, they're not quite there. I'm not going to pay the mark. Now, this is teacher A and teacher B for extension. Now, the 2 mainstream classes is teacher C, the same teacher. And so the same teacher has given 70%, well, the same marking for part A, which is collaborative marking, 17 and 72%. So really those 2 classes showing themselves, to be relatively consistent across the mainstream classes, and we're quite happy with that. If you look at part B, for this same teacher marking, we've got 60 and 65. So really we're seeing a very, very close reduction in marks from part A to part B, and part B was a little bit more difficult. And so we would expect the marks to drop down. We just wouldn't expect a massive difference. Now, if you go back to teacher B has marked the mainstream 3, which is really kind of a foundation class at 61%, which is not unexpected. We would see a drop again to mainstream 3. But then part B at 45% is a big drop compared to the mainstream 1 and mainstream 2. And so actually teacher B, it looks like, is actually applying the agreed on marking key a little bit more stringently, or less willing to give the 50-50 marks than teacher A. And so what we're seeing now is for the same test, for the same agreed marking key, a little bit of a difference in how these marks are being applied. So what we're seeing with Gradescope really is really improving moderation between classes. And it's allowing us to see how our classes are going compared to one another. Because particularly when we move students between classes, from year 7 and 8. So if students are really working hard from mainstream, want to get into the extension classes, we really need to know, are our top mainstream classes actually stronger academically than our bottom extension classes students? Do they deserve that place in the extension class above a student we would move down? And so it gives us real clarity in that respect. And so it's been really, Gradescope's been really good for us in this, and it's highlighted some areas where we've got some inconsistencies in marking. And I think Gradescope's going to help us solve part of that problem. Type of assessments that we can support with Gradescope. So we're 6 months in, and we're finding basically Gradescope supports all assessment types. And if it can be scanned, it can be Gradescoped. So we Gradescoping or is this assessment Gradescoped has become a bit of a phrase around our science department. So what we're finding, anything that can be scanned can be marked, but there are some assessments which work better than other assessments. So the teacher feedback I've got so far is that it's best for mathematical and short answer questions. It is, but where it's extended response answers, so these questions where the answers probably span over more than one page, that starts to become a little bit more difficult. So it's kind of, I'd call it a little bit clumsy on Gradescope to mark those questions. And so teachers are actually finding that they prefer to mark those by hand. And there is a setup time involved. So there is the scanning of assessments into Gradescope. So again, what we're finding is we've got some very small 8-hour classes where we may have 6 or 7 students. For those classes, it's not making sense at the moment to put those through Gradescope because it's one teacher to one class, and the setup time is actually really is taking them longer than the time saving. So what have we learned as well about optimizing our assessments for Gradescope? So we can do things to set up assessments to make the marking quicker. So if you're doing multiple choice type questions, what we previously did for our marking keys is students would just cross the correct answer or circle the correct answer, but Gradescope is not really a big fan of, the AI doesn't recognize that so well. It does a pretty good job, but there's certainly a certain amount of sorting to do at the end of these answers. But the students where we're asking them to shade in the answers, so we're saying be like this, then actually what's happening is Gradescope is very, very efficient at detecting that, and it's very, very good. And even I've been finding that we tell students if they change their mind, so if they said, actually, I chose B here, but I want to choose D, we get them to cross it out and they select D. What we're finding is that the AI is adapting to that and selecting D. Mostly these are now being selected as D as the correct answer, whereas and it's recognizing that the student wanted to choose D. And there's very few of these now getting through into the manual sorting, of assessments. Another way that we can set up assessments is to try to make what students are going to write in spaces more predictable. So this is a table for a year 7 test on the 5 kingdoms. And so the 5 kingdoms will be Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, Protista, and Monera. Now, this is possibly my favorite subject to teach in year 7, not because I'm a biologist, I'm a physicist, but because I get to tell the students that I belong to Kingdom Fungi because I'm a fungi. And I always get students who example of organisms. So Kingdom Fungi, example of Mr. Braithwaite. I don't pay the mark on that, but they get a little bit of a smiley face from me on that one. But this table is hard to mark in Gradescope because the student's got choice of 5 things, and it's unpredictable where exactly in that table they're going to put the 5 answers. So we can make use of the Gradescope AI by maybe making it a little bit more predictable. So maybe what we could do here is put the first letter for the kingdoms into the table, so the students are kind of guided by what is the first letter. Or we need to rethink this question to make the best use of the AI to make our marking more efficient. Also, we've found that adding in these, it's probably quite hard for you to see here, but these little lines here, do not write in this zone, is useful because we've invested in a fairly heavy duty guillotine. And when we're coming to chop down exams, for example, having that do not write line there, making it a lot easier to cut the exams without worrying about slicing off parts of students' work. Next steps. So what are the next steps for us at Carey? So we're going to continue our trial into next year. We're going to broaden its use within the science department. there are some teachers who so I would say at the moment that I've got some teachers who are using Gradescope for everything. They love it. They they wouldn't go back to anything else now. And I've got some other teachers who are a little bit skeptical, a little bit hesitant. And I think part of that is because they are unfamiliar and they maybe haven't provided enough training. The other reason, though, is the third point on here is training for regular relief staff. Some of the feedback I've had from teachers is that particularly for 7s and 8s, we've got really good relief staff here, and they offer to do marking for us at various times. And so one teacher said, "Well, if I hadn't had Gradescope, it would have been marked for me by someone else." So I guess the feedback from that is that not marking assessment is better than marking an assessment in time-wise. So I think, but we do have fairly regular relief staff. So I'm going to try and get those relief staff trained up so that they can then have access to Gradescope and do marking for teachers when they're free. The third thing we want to do is we want to trial Gradescope for low stakes formative assessments. And this is actually what I'm particularly excited about because we get this really quick turnaround with the marking and we get these really brilliant analytics. And so as a school, we're trying to think about how do we reduce the assessment load on students, particularly in 7 to 9, and how do we make assessment more about informing the students about what they know or what they've learned, rather than just about getting a grade. And so we're really looking at options for low stakes formative assessments where we can provide students feedback by topic, not by question. And we can mark, 20, 30 mark assessments within a day and have that feedback to students and to the class really for the next class, so that the teacher and the students can really act on that feedback. So if a student in year 7 chemistry is a little bit, the class comes out very low in the particle model for matter, the teacher can actually act on that, and the next lesson they can do a review lesson for the particle theory of matter. If only some students were weak on understanding dissolving in year 7 chemistry, what we can do is we can actually set some personalized homework for students based on how they have gone in particular subjects. And so next year, we're going to be really looking at how can we make Gradescope work for us in this low stakes formative assessment zone, where we can really provide feedback to students, not on what percentage are you at, but have you mastered this topic or not? And if you haven't, what are we going to do about it? And so that's going to be a very interesting phase next year. And maybe we can report back to Turnitin on how that's been going partway through the year. That is it from me in terms of my talking. So I'll hand it over for questions.
Thanks, Daniel. That was a very insightful presentation. And by the way, I like the name Phone Guy. I think it's a way to keep your students engaged as long as they don't misuse it. That's the most important thing. We've had some questions come through, but they've been answered by Michael Ryan because they're mostly product-related questions. So we won't worry you about that. I do have some questions which I prepped just because we worked with you on your presentation. My first question would be, to what degree has Gradescope met your expectations for flexibility and resilience in the shift to remote learning, if that ever happened?
Yeah, we haven't, because in Perth we've been pretty lucky that I think our students last year missed a week of school. This year haven't missed any school. So we really haven't been put into a position where we've had to move to remote learning. So I do understand there are quite a few features around online assessments that Gradescope do, which look quite useful. We haven't really had a need to explore them as yet.
Great. I think you've also responded to this, but I'll just pose the question for anyone who's just joining the session at any point during this webcast. What were your biggest pain points in administering or marking assessment prior to Gradescope?
So administration wise, I think that it's the handling, I think particularly the handling of papers and then the adding up of the marks afterwards. So teachers were taking bunches of stacks of paper home. they would then be marking them and bringing them back to school. But if they, I actually had one teacher comment that he was trying to get to sleep. He couldn't sleep, but he had scanned his assessments into Gradescope and set it all up. So he got up and did some marking. If that had been on the paper system, he wouldn't have taken the assessments home and he wouldn't have been able to do that. Also, I think in year 10, so our year 10 extension science, we have 3 teachers across, or 2 to 3 teachers, depending on the number of students in extension. And we rotate specialist teachers through the subject. So chemistry teacher for chemistry, a physics teacher for physics. But what that means is for our year 10 exams, we've probably got anywhere between, depending on a year group, 60 to 90 exams that have been marked by 2 to 3 teachers. And we were organising weekend drops so that, the time from when the exams are sat to the times that they're marked at the school, we don't get much time. We get probably 4 days to get the assessments marked. So we were kind of arranging on Saturday, a teacher would take them home on Friday, mark through them on Friday night, take a batch of papers to another teacher, swap over batches of papers, take them home, mark them. And that was happening on weekends. This year we did that with the Gradescope, and one teacher basically said, well, I got up on Saturday morning, I made a coffee and I sat in bed and I marked half of my biology exams. So we've really seen kind of some gains in administration in that respect. Not having to add up marks afterwards. So we're getting less errors. So teachers were making errors and adding up the marks. And, it was almost like the first thing you'd ask students to do when you handed back an assessment, make sure I've added everything up correctly. And so the students would spend 15 minutes simply checking your mathematics rather than engaging with the content. And so that's been reduced. And I think, and then particularly, I've already mentioned this, but when parents or students want to re-look at an assessment, so it's a parent-teacher interview or the parents come in before school to have a chat to the teacher about how their student's going, it's very, very easy to pull up assessments. So you can just click, a few clicks and their assessment is in front of you. And you can go through that in detail with the student or the parent, rather than having to, we've in our science office, we've got boxes, these, old paper boxes full of assessments for the year. And you want to find little Jack some year 7 biology paper that's actually going to take you about 20 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges when it comes to marking papers is the room for error, that small room for error. And I'm surprised the students actually spend more time trying to make sure you've given them a perfect mark and you've added it up correctly. So
my description is what would happen when we get feedback for an assessment is you give the assessment back. The first thing students would do would add up the marks to make sure it's correct. They would then spend about 10 minutes trying to work out their percentages if it's a year 7 student. And then they would figure out their mark. They'd look at their friend's mark and then, in their head, they're switched off. Wow. So that feedback process is then really only to those students who are self-motivated to process that. But now with Gradescope, we've got a method where we can, the students are seeing, the information is more available to them. It's more transparent to them. They're spending more time engaging with what did I get? What didn't I get? Why didn't I get that mark?
Yeah, I think this is also quite slightly responding to my next question, which is regards to students actually. It says, how do you feel Gradescope has impacted your students in terms of the quality and timeliness of feedback they receive?
So we're still in a transition phase, so we're not marking every assessment with Gradescope, but I think the assessments we are marking with Gradescope, certainly I've been doing a very intensive trial with my year 12 physics class, and I'm getting assessments back to them either between 1 or 2 lessons after the assessment. Whereas previous to that, the previous year, it would be between, I would think, more like 5 to 7 days. So kind of really more than half the time frame for them to get assessments back. Sorry, what was the question?
It's basically just saying, how do you feel Gradescope has impacted your students in terms of the quality and the timeliness of the feedback they receive?
So, I think definitely the quality of the feedback is better because it's no longer ticks and crosses. We currently have a policy in our department where we don't release tests back to students because we reuse tests from year to year. But so their students they see it in class, but we collect it back up again. And it is limiting students' feedback, and it's limiting our use of the Gradescope releasing marks online. And I actually think the Gradescope releasing the assessment online is really powerful for the students. So we're actually really now rethinking, well, is there a way that we can that we can release assessments to students without having, it's just rethinking about, I don't want my teachers having to rewrite every single test every year, because that's quite a significant amount of work again. So you solve one time problem, you add on another one, but we're rethinking what we can do in that space to utilize Gradescope's online feedback, which I really like, without then, taking time from one thing and adding it to another.
Yeah. I think it's more like a comment from Connie Price. She's saying also having an electronic marking workflow adds a level of reduction of risk, as harder to lose a paper or interfere with the responses, which is basically what you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. One more question, and this is from me, just because I'm a fan of, if you're really loving how a product is working, tell other people about it, because I see the academic community as a space that requires more knowledge sharing to happen, and creating that space where people can share knowledge. So this is an example of that space. If there's one thing you'd like to share with your peers who are considering Gradescope, what would that be?
Yeah, good question. So I would actually say that you should start out by using the free trial version, because that's what I did. I initially used the free trial version. Now, you don't get the AI features, but you do get the benefits of flicking through the manual grading and get a feel for what it's like. And really, that's what sold me on the benefits of Gradescope. And then when we had access to the AI stuff, it's like, wow, this is really quick. This is really efficient. But I think I would say initially sign up for the free trial, try the free trial, see how that works for you, and then and I think that it will hook you in anyway. But that's what I would say.
Okay, great, thank you. I think that's one of the that's a great feedback. People would like to learn from as well. We don't have any other questions. I'm just going to pause a little bit for maybe another 1 minute if any questions come through. And
I've got a couple of questions that I could bring up.
Okay, perfect.
There's a couple of that have been hidden in the chat here. So there's one question, first of all, from Melinda. Daniel, I'm not sure if you can address this, otherwise I will. Melinda has said that she's had a play around with Gradescope yesterday and she's impressed, but she's concerned that the marking key cannot be preloaded before the scans or the student submissions are uploaded. How do you get around this?
Yeah, so what we do is we've got some what we call shadow students that we've created. So we've got Mark Wright as one of our students, a shadow student, and we've got Anne Swears-Key as another student. And we just create dummy students and we enter that dummy student in and we use that student to create the marking key. So essentially what we do is you load up your assessment in a normal way. You set your boundaries for questions and for the student name or ID. And then what you do is you upload the same blank assessment and assign that blank assessment to, we assign that to Mark Wright or Anne Swears-Key. And then we go through each question, adding our marking key that way so that it's kind of pre-set up. And then we delete the student. And the nice thing about Gradescope is delete the student, the marking key remains.
Perfect. Thank you, Daniel. That is the workaround that we have in place at the moment. I will just let you know that our development team is currently working on adding the ability for you to be able to create rubrics when the assignment or the template is created. All that information is actually on our public roadmap. And I'm just going to pop the link to that roadmap into the chat just now. I've actually linked the exact card for that tool so that you can see where that's at. In the roadmap, you can also see where any of our other feature developments are at as well.
So in terms of features, a question, I guess this is my question now to the Turnitin guys. We really love the functionality of the bubble sheets, but at the moment it's on 100 questions per page, and we're finding for some of our year 7s that the bubbles are pretty small. And I know that possibly in development is a smaller number of question bubble sheet. Is that in the pipeline?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, but that's one that we can follow up with the Gradescope, definitely.
So it's the only reason really why we're not using the bubble sheet at the moment is because it's the little bubbles are a little bit too small for our year 7s. Yeah. And I can see how it's useful at university level with 200, with lots of questions, but year 7 struggle with the little circles.
We'll definitely take that up as feedback and feedback to the product team. Yeah. There's one question which just came through. I'm just looking at the time. I've got about 10 minutes. It says, can Gradescope be applied on problem-solving items? I'm assuming this is mathematics and physics. I'm not sure if it's...
No, so I think if you're talking about problem-based, more like problem-based learning, we haven't tried that yet. And I'm not sure how it would go in a more, so if it's problem-based learning where it's a lot more open-ended, where one student could produce a poster and another student could produce a video. To be honest with you, I wouldn't necessarily see the value in Gradescope at that point because you can't scan a video. But if the product was going to be the same and it was, say like a drawing or a poster, potentially yes. Again, I'm not 100% convinced that Gradescope in that instance would be quicker. It depends on what other systems you've got to mark assessments in that way.
Yeah, the only thing I would like to add is, and I think this is Leo Jem Vilava, if you'd like to share with us what the use cases are, where you can reach us on help@gradescope.com and someone will follow up. I think it's quite a broad question. Problems can be solved across different disciplines. So you can understand the use case. That will help us support you best where we know how. Other than that, we've got 8 minutes to go. And I would like to say a big thank you to Daniel for an insightful presentation. Thank you so much for being a champion for Gradescope across the Asia Pacific. If you'd like to learn more about Gradescope, in the chat, we're going to post the weekly Thursday, 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Time. I'm sure we're doing daylight savings now. So you see the link to that. Please register for the workshop and join the rest of the community learning about Gradescope. And if you'd like to also listen to or watch the other webcast series we've done in the past for this year, the link is also in the chat there. Thank you again, everyone who's joined the session. I hope you remain safe. And from us at Turnitin, thank you for always tuning into this webcast. Thank you.